Om Namo Bhagavate Vasudevaya.
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 Thank you for coming. Hare Krishna. Today we are reading from Srimad Bhagavad-Gita as it is, chapter 13, entitled Nature, the Enjoyer and Consciousness, and text number 26. Anye evam ajānantaḥ. śrutvānyebhya upāsate. Tepi cātitaranty mṛtyuṁ śruti-parāyaṇāḥ. Anye, others, too, but evam, thus, ajānantaḥ, without spiritual knowledge, śrutvā, by hearing, anyebhyaḥ, from others, upāsate, begin to worship, te, they, api, also, cha, and, atitaranti, transcend, evam, certainly, mṛtyuṁ, the path of death, śruti-parāyaṇāḥ, inclined to the process of hearing. Translation and purport by His Divine Grace A.C. Bhaktivedanta Swami Srila Prabhupada. Again, there are those who, although not conversant in spiritual knowledge, begin to worship the Supreme Person upon hearing about Him from others. Because of their tendency to hear from authorities, they also transcend the path of birth and death. Please repeat. Again, there are those who, although not conversant in spiritual knowledge, begin to worship the Supreme Person upon hearing about Him from others. Because of their tendency to hear from authorities, they also transcend the path of birth and death. Purport. This verse is particularly applicable to modern society, because in modern society there is practically no education in spiritual matters. Some of the people may appear to be atheistic or agnostic or philosophical, but actually there is no knowledge of philosophy. As for the common man, if he is a good soul, then there is a chance for advancement by hearing. This hearing process is very important. Lord Chaitanya, who preached Krishna consciousness in the modern world, gave great stress to hearing, because if the common man simply hears from authoritative sources, he can progress, especially according to Lord Chaitanya, if he hears the transcendental vibration, Hare Krishna, Krishna Krishna, Hare Hare, Hare Rama, Rama Rama, Hare Hare. It is stated, therefore, that all men should take advantage of hearing from realized souls and gradually become able to understand everything. The worship of the Supreme Lord will then undoubtedly take place. Lord Chaitanya has said that in this age, no one needs to change his position, but one should give up the endeavor to understand the absolute truth by speculative reasoning. One should learn to become the servant of those who are in knowledge of the Supreme Lord. If one is fortunate enough to take shelter of a pure devotee, hear from him about self-realization, and follow in his footsteps, one will gradually be elevated to the position of a pure devotee. In this verse particularly, the process of hearing is strongly recommended, and this is very appropriate. Although the common man is often not as capable as so-called philosophers, faithful hearing from an authoritative person will help one transcend this material existence and go back home, back to Godhead. Om ajānantamirandasya gananjana shalakaya chakshuranmaritam yena tasmai Shri Gurave Namaha Shri Chaitanya Manobhistam Stapitam Yena Bhutale Sayam Rupa Kadamayam Dadati Svapadantikam Vandeyaham Shri Guru Shri Yuta Parakamalam Shri Gurun Vaishnavamscha Shri Rupam Sagrajatan Sahagana Raghunatan Vitam Tam Sajivam Sadvaitam Savadutam Parijana Sahitam Krishna Chaitanya Devam Shri Radha Krishna Padan Sahagana Lalita Shri ISKCON Vitamscha Hey Krishna Karuna Sindhu Dinavando Jagapate Gopesha Gopika Kanta Radha Kanta Namostate Tapta Kanchana Gaurangi Radhe Vrindavaneshwari Vrishabhanu Sute Devi Pranamami Haripriye Panchakalpatarubhyascha Kripa Sindhubhya Evacha Patitanam Pavanebhyo Vaishnavebhyo Namo Namaha Nama Om Vishnu Padaya Krishna Prestaya Bhutare Srimati Bhakti-vedanta Swaminiti Namane Namaste Saraswati Devi Gauravani Pracharine Nirvishesha Shunyavadi Paschatya Deshatarine Jai Shri Krishna Chaitanya Prabhu Nityananda Shri Advaita Gadadha Sivasadi Gaura Bhakta-vrinda Hare Krishna 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 Hare 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 Rama 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 Anye evam ajānantaḥ śrutvānyebhya upāsate te api cātitaranty eva mṛtyuṁ śruti-parāyaṇāḥ. Again, there are those who, although not conversant in spiritual knowledge, begin to worship the Supreme Person about hearing about him from others. Because of their tendency to hear from authorities, they also transcend the path of birth and death. So, because this verse starts with the words again, so it means that it's referring to previous verses. So actually these verses from verse 20 up until this verse 26 go together, because they explain what this knowledge is that we're going to learn about the field of activities and the knower of the field, and what its significance is to us in our lives. We've had devotees question, why are we learning all this of jnana when we've just studied 6 chapters on bhakti? And so this particular section of verses explain exactly why this knowledge is important to us, and conclude with the benefits of this knowledge. And then I'll also refer back to the 4th chapter, which is about transcendental knowledge, which also explains the same things with a slightly different emphasis. So if I start from verse 13:20 and just summarize this section so we can study it a little bit. 13:20 Prakritim purusham chaiva vidyanadi ubhavapi vikarams chagunams chaiva vidi prakriti sambhavam. So material nature and living entities should be understood to be beginningless. That's anadi. Their transformation in the modes of matter are products of material nature. So this, as explained by Burijan Prabhu in Surrender Unto Me, this is Krishna's explanation about how the material nature, Prakriti, combines with the Purushas, that is the individual soul, and then also the super soul. Text 20 to 22 refer to the, and 24 refer to the soul, and the super soul is referred to in text 23. And this interaction between the soul, the super soul, and the material nature is said to be anadi, beginningless. In Srila Prabhupada's purport, it says, actually, the living entity is originally part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, but due to his rebellious nature, he is conditioned within material nature. So Srila Prabhupada goes on to say, it really does not matter how these living entities or superior entities of the Lord have come in contact with material nature. So this example is Srila Prabhupada would often say, if you're drowning, you don't really need to discuss how it was you slipped off the boat and fell into the water, how it was you got there. What you need to do is get out. So Srila Prabhupada is making it clear here. He's saying it does not really matter how these living entities or superior entities of the Supreme Lord have come in contact with material nature. And then he goes on to say, the Supreme Personality of Godhead knows, however, how and why this actually took place. So Prabhupada leaves it for us to meditate on how Krishna is aware of how and why we've come into this material world. And of course it's well explained in our literatures, how and why we've come here. But what this knowledge is to give us the understanding that will help us get out of it. As this selection of verses will continue to say, this understanding, this knowledge will lead us to liberation, to getting out of this entanglement. And Burijan goes on to say, both the living entity and the Lord are changeless and eternal. Only the material nature undergoes vikara, transformation. Although the living entity remains unchanged, out of ignorance, he identifies with the changes of the body. So, in 13:21, karya karana kartatve hetu prakriti uchyate purusha sukadukhanam bhoktritve hetur uchyate. Nature is said to be the cause of all material causes and effects, whereas the living entity is the cause of the various sufferings or enjoyments in this world. So previously Krishna has explained several times this concept of the doer, and this text again addresses that context, that nature actually causes the causes and effects, but the sufferings or enjoyments are the responsibility of the living entity. So Burijan explains, the living entity is the cause of all his sufferings and enjoyments because he has illicitly embraced Maya with the desire to predominate and enjoy independently of Krishna. And so this is the cause of our entanglement. Getting engaged with material nature, with Maya, with the idea of wanting to predominate and enjoy independently. Thus he becomes entangled in material nature. So, taking his karma into consideration, the material nature then creates for him a field, meant ultimately for suffering. So the material nature creates a specific field according to the karma of each different living entity. And this all takes place under the sanction of the actual Purusha, the Supersoul. Now this verse has talked about the Purusha being the living entity, but because he's a false Purusha. He is wanting to enjoy, therefore he is called Purusha, but actually he's not Purusha. And that's also why in these texts we always refer to the living entity as a he, even though we know in the material nature there are men and women, but actually all of us want to enjoy. We want to be the enjoyer. So that puts us all in the role of Purusha. So even though we're actually all, by constitution, we're all Prakriti, we're all feminine energy, but we have a mentality of wanting to enjoy. So therefore the word he is appropriate in talking about us. Prabhupada explains that. I found his explanation of that somewhere in the Bhagavatam. He explains that. So therefore, although nature is the cause of the entire material manifestation, the living entity causes his own happiness and distress. And this very famous verse that Srila Prabhupada often quoted, 13.26, Purusha prakriti stohi bhunkte prakriti jan gunan karanam guna sangosya sad asad yoni janmasu. The living entity in material nature thus follows the ways of life, enjoying the three modes of nature. This is due to his association with that material nature. Thus he meets with good and evil among various species. So Krishna actually is the only bhakta, the only enjoyer. And the jiva is described by Krishna in 7th chapter, 5th verse, as his energy, subordinate energy. But he is placed within material energy. This was what is meant by Purusha prakriti stohi. So Purusha, this false enjoyer, prakriti sto, is placed into this material energy. And he imagines himself to be a Purusha. So thus the jiva focuses his attempt on what he wants to do, enjoying the creations of the gunas, bhunkte, which means enjoying, prakriti jan gunan, those things that come out of the modes of nature. By associating with the material nature in an enjoying spirit, karanam guna sango asya, the jiva traps himself in the cycle of repeated birth and death. Sad asad yoni janmasu. So here Buddhijan makes an interesting statement. He puts in exclamation marks. But he says, by our attempt to enjoy the material nature, we practically become matter, because we so strongly identify it with ourselves, with the body. We think we're being born, we think we're growing, we think we're becoming an adult, we think we're producing, we think we're dwindling, and we think we're dying. We actually think we die. So we actually, he puts becomes in the parenthesis, he becomes matter, because we so strongly identify it. And this text 23, which refers to the Supersoul. Upadras tanumanta cha bharata bhakta maheshvara paramatmeti chapyukto dehesmin purusham para. Yet in this body there is another, a transcendental enjoyer, who is the Lord, the Supreme Proprietor, who exists as an overseer and permitter, and who is known as the Supersoul. So this is talking about our relationship with the Supersoul, because all these things are described here, and describes the qualities of the Supersoul in our relationship with him. So he's the only enjoyer, he's the transcendental enjoyer. He is the Supreme Proprietor. He is the overseer and permitter, means he supervises everything in this material world. In his role as Supersoul, he's a supervisor. And he's the permitter, he allows things to happen. But that doesn't mean we can blame him, because we made the choices and we're the ones responsible for our happiness and distress. Okay, so this verse describes the relationship between Paramatma and Jivatma. In the language of this chapter, they are both kshetrajñā. Here the super soul is called Purusha Para, the transcendental enjoyer. He is overseer and permitter, and by his sanction the living entity may attempt to fulfill his desires and act as Purusha. So Srila Prabhupada explains in the purport that every living entity is eternal part and parcel of the Supreme Lord, and both of them are very intimately related as friends. So this is also described by the two birds in the tree analogy. The two birds are the friends, they're friendly birds sitting in the tree. But the living entity has this tendency to reject the help of his friend, the Supreme Lord, and act independently. And because of this, he is called the marginal energy of the Lord. So therefore, as long as the living entity is in the material energy, he is conditioned by that energy. But his friend, the Supreme Lord, stays with him as a super soul, just to try and encourage him to return to the spiritual energy. So therefore, from outside, he gives instructions as stated in the Bhagavad-Gita, and from within he tries to convince the living entity that these activities in the material field are not conducive to real happiness. The Supreme Lord is implying, just give it all up and turn your faith towards me. That will make you happy. So then, from text 24 onwards, explains what's the result of understanding this, understanding how the living entity gets entangled in material nature, and how the super soul is there as his friend and his witness and his permitter. Ya evam veti purusham prakritam saguna saha sarvatha vartamanopi na sabhuyo bhajayate. One who understands this philosophy concerning material nature, the living entity, and the interactions of the modes of nature, is sure to attain liberation. So if we can understand this interaction and how we get entangled in the modes of material nature because of our desire to enjoy, that will help withdraw us from it and will take us to liberation. He will not take birth here again, regardless of his present position. So Srila Prabhupada explains, clear understanding of material nature, the super soul, the individual soul, and their interrelation makes one eligible to become liberated and turn to the spiritual atmosphere without being forced to return to the material nature. Then the verse that was read yesterday, verse 25, which is referred to directly in today's verse. Some perceive the super soul within themselves through meditation, others through cultivation of knowledge, and still others through working without fruit of results. So this is describing three different methods of approaching the super soul. Remember that we had Gyayam, the object of knowledge, which was described earlier from verses 13 onwards. Gyayam, 13 was the soul, and from 14 through to about 18 was talking about the super soul. The super soul is the object of knowledge, and different means of approaching him are being described. So the first one is to perceive the super soul within themselves through meditation. This refers to the Ashtanga yogis who meditate on the Paramatma. Cultivation of knowledge refers to the Sankhya yogi, practicing of the instructions of Lord Kapila to know the super soul. Baladev Vidyabhushan states that the practitioners of Sankhya yoga have philosophy as their primary means and meditation as their secondary means. Working without fruit of desires refers to Nishkam Karma Yoga. Baladev Vidyabhushan says that such persons may engage in seeking philosophical knowledge or meditate, but their primary means of understanding the Supersoul is detached work. So this is the meditation on the Supersoul, the Ashtanga Yogi, the Sankhya Yoga, which is the Jnani, and then the Karma Yogi. And then today's verse. Again, there are those who, although not conversant in spiritual knowledge, begin to worship the Supreme Person about hearing from Him, from others. Because of their tendency to hear from authorities, they also transcend the path of birth and death. So this is important to us, as Srila Prabhupada says in his purport, because we're not up to all these other methods so well. Srila Prabhupada even explains that people appear to be atheistic. So atheistic means not believing in God. Agnostic means having no real conviction either way. Does God exist or does God not exist? I don't know. Or philosophical means to try and understand through reasoning. But Prabhupada says actually there is no knowledge of philosophy. None of these people actually really know anything. So this means this leaves them open to learn from hearing, if they can follow the process of hearing. So Srila Prabhupada goes on to say that all men should take advantage of hearing from realized souls and gradually become able to understand everything. So engaging in this practice of hearing is not directly giving us the knowledge. Engaging in this process of hearing submissively from authoritative sources, we will gradually be able to understand everything. And then the ultimate result is the worship of the Supreme Lord will then take place. So there are two conditions that are given for this process of hearing to reach fruition and gradually be able to become to understand everything. Srila Prabhupada says one should give up the endeavor to understand the absolute truth by speculative reasoning. In other words, we're not hearing in order to try and understand with our own intelligence. We have to give up trying to understand by speculative reasoning, thinking that by my own endeavor we can understand. One should learn to become servant of those who are in knowledge of the Supreme Lord. So this is a second condition. If one is fortunate enough to take shelter of a pure devotees, hear from him about self-realization and follow in his footsteps, one will gradually be elevated to the position of pure devotee. So that in this verse particularly, the process of hearing is strongly recommended, and this is very appropriate. Although the common man is often not as capable as so-called philosophers, faithful hearing from an authoritative person will help one transcend this material existence and go back home, back to Godhead. So Srila Prabhupada has stressed that any common man, as long as he is a good soul, may be able to advance by hearing. Lord Chaitanya stresses hearing, especially the Maha Mantra, and we have to these two conditions: give up the endeavor to know the absolute truth by speculative reasoning, and learn to become a servant of those in knowledge of the Supreme Lord. So the benediction from following this process, where we gradually understand everything and automatically come to worship the Supreme Lord. So therefore the advice that's given in this purport is take shelter of a pure devotee by good fortune, hear from him and follow in his footsteps, and thus you will be raised to pure devotion. So following this, it goes on to a summary of this knowledge. So we're not going to go into that. What I wanted to look at was where this is also explained in the 4th chapter. Many of these things are also explained. Which fourth chapter is entitled Transcendental Knowledge. So, 4.19. One is understood to be in full knowledge, whose every endeavor is devoid of desire for sense gratification. So we discussed that all earlier, how this desire for sense gratification leads us to becoming entangled in the material nature and leads to our happiness and distress. So this has already been covered in the fourth chapter. One is said to be understood to be in full knowledge, whose every endeavor is devoid of the desires for sense gratification. He is said by sages to be a worker, for whom the reactions of work have been burnt up by the fire of perfect knowledge. Abandoning all attachment to the results of his activities, ever satisfied and independent, he performs no fruit of action, although engaged in all kinds of active undertakings. So this is also stressed in today's purport. In this age, one need not give up one's occupation. Lord Chaitanya has said, Lord Chaitanya has said that in this age no one needs to change his position. One needs to only to give up the endeavor for trying to understand by oneself. Such a man of understanding acts with mind and intelligence perfectly controls, gives up all sense of proprietorship over his possessions, and acts only for the bare necessities of life. Thus working, he is not affected by sinful reactions. He who is satisfied with gain which comes of its own accord, who is free from duality and does not envy, who is steady in both success and failure, is never entangled although performing actions. The work of a man who is unattached to the modes of material nature and who fully situated in transcendental knowledge merges entirely into transcendence. So this one is quite similar to that verse. Number 24. One who understands this philosophy concerning material nature, the living entity, and the interaction of the modes of nature is sure to attain liberation. So in this 4.23, it says, one who is situated in transcendental knowledge merges into transcendence. A person fully absorbed in Krishna consciousness is sure to attain the spiritual kingdom because of his full contribution to spiritual activities, in which the summation is absolute and that which is offered is of the same spiritual nature. So in the third chapter, Krishna had recommended that one perform sacrifice. So then here in this fourth chapter, this process of sacrifice is explained further. And this ties into this again, because the beginning of the process is we take an interest in learning something about spiritual nature. And then we're given some instructions. If you want to learn, then you engage in these processes. You chant 16 rounds, you follow the regular principles. These are all varieties of sacrifice. So in the beginning, our sadhana is sacrifice. We don't actually have knowledge. We don't actually yet have a relationship with Krishna. But we perform sacrifice to Krishna in order to gain that. So these sacrifices are then described. Some yogis perform sacrifice to the demigods. Some offer in the fire of the Supreme Brahman. Some sacrifice the hearing process. So hearing is again stressed in the fourth chapter. And the others, the regulated household, sacrifice the objects of the senses. Others control the mind and senses, offer the functions of the senses into the controlled mind. Others sacrifice their possessions, perform Sapphiric austerities or the eightfold mysticism, or studying the Vedas to attain transcendental knowledge. So then, having engaged in this process of sacrifice, because the sacrifice is our sadhana. In the beginning, sacrifice is our sadhana. So we engage in that process of sacrifice, and then we will advance towards transcendental knowledge. In text 430, all these performers who know the meaning of sacrifice become cleansed of sinful reactions, and having tasted the nectar of the results of sacrifices, they advance towards the supreme eternal atmosphere. So once we engage in this process of sacrifice, engaging in our sadhana under the guidance of the authority, then we'll come to understand the meaning of sacrifice, become cleansed of sinful reactions. Tasting the nectar of the sacrifice means that we get some benefit from it. If we engage in our sadhana in Krishna consciousness, we will start to realize that our mind is becoming more peaceful. We're not feeling so much envious of other people. We're able to tolerate things that previously we couldn't tolerate. So this benefit is coming to us, and we're starting to reap the benefits. So we taste the nectar of the results of our sacrifice, and then advance towards the supreme eternal atmosphere. Then text 431. O best of the Kuru dynasties, without sacrifice one can never live happily on this planet or in this life. What then of the next? In 32. All these different types of sacrifices are approved by the Vedas, and all of them are born of different types of work. Knowing them as such, you'll become liberated. So again, understanding our process and understanding where it's going, this leads us to liberation. And 33, the sacrifice performed in knowledge is better than the mere sacrifice of material possessions. After all, O son of Pritha, all sacrifices of work culminate in transcendental knowledge. So once we engage in this sacrifice, we will get transcendental knowledge. And then, as was stressed in the purport to today's verse, that we should hear from the authoritative sources. And it was stressed that our two conditions, are to give up the endeavour to know by speculative reasoning and learn to be a servant of those in knowledge. So text 43 expresses that wanting to be a servant. Tadvidi pranipatena pariprashnena sevaya upadekshanti te jnanam jnaninas tattvadarshina. Just try to learn the truth by approaching a spiritual master. Inquire from him submissively and render service unto him. The self-realized souls can impart knowledge unto you because they have seen the truth. And 35. Yaj gyātvāna pamaramoham evam yasyasi pandava yena bhutanya sheshani drakshasyat manyatomai. Having attained real knowledge from a self-realized soul, you will never fall again into such illusion. For by this knowledge you will see that all living entities are but part of the Supreme, or in other words, that they are mine. So this whole process, if we can understand how we're entrapped in this material nature, this is the beginning of how to get out of it. And then we will become liberated. So let me just read this verse again. Anye evam ajānantaḥ śrutvānyebhya upāsate te api cātitaranty mṛtyuṁ śruti-parāyaṇāḥ. Again, there are those who, although not conversive in spiritual knowledge, begin to worship the Supreme upon hearing about him from others. Because of their tendency to hear from authorities, they also transcend the path of birth and death. Now, I was just remembering in the 10th chapter, there is a verse there that also talks about how even though we're not conversive in spiritual knowledge, if we're sincere, we will make advancement. In the verse 10.10, which is Tesam satata yuktanam bhajatam priti purvakam didami buddhi yogam tam yena mam upayanti te. To those constantly devoted to serving me with love, I give the understanding by which they can come to me. And the last verse, the last paragraph of the purport, Srila Prabhupada says, a person may have a bona fide spiritual master and may be attached to a spiritual organization, but if he is still not intelligent enough to make progress, then Krishna from within gives him instructions so that he may ultimately come to him without difficulty. The qualification is that a person always engage himself in Krishna consciousness and with love and devotion render all kinds of services. He should perform some work for Krishna, and that work should be with love. If a devotee is not intelligent enough to make progress on the path of self-realization, but is sincere and devoted to the activities of devotional service, the Lord gives him a chance to make progress and ultimately to attain him. So that we don't need any material qualification in order to come to Krishna. We need to be sincere, take up this process of sacrifice, which is our sadhana, and we will be gradually led to transcendental knowledge, which will lead us to liberation, which will lead us to knowing the Supreme Lord, which will lead us to be constantly engaged in His service. That's the whole purport of these verses from 13:20 through to 26. So it very much affirms the importance of these last 6 chapters of Bhagavad-Gita, how they give us the understanding. Even though all we need to do is chant the holy names, if we're chanting with offences, if we're chanting with a false conception, we're not going to make the right advancement. So although it's perfectly true that someone completely uneducated can become Krishna conscious, if we start to use our mind in the wrong way and take ourselves away from Krishna consciousness, then we're not going to achieve the results. So we need to at least have sufficient understanding. Even if we're not intelligent, we need sufficient understanding to dedicate ourselves to the process and be sincere, and to try sincerely to offer with love, as Srila Prabhupada has said in this purport to 10.10. Okay, so now I'm going to ask if anyone's got any questions or comments to today's class, any additions. Hare Krishna, Prabhu. Yes. So Prabhupada here in this verse said, hearing from authoritative sources. So Prabhupada has explained that as long he was speaking to his disciples about how they can become preachers. And he says, as long as you repeat my words, then to that extent you are a pure devotee. So all of us can be preachers. All of us can serve Srila Prabhupada by spreading Krishna consciousness all around the world, providing we sincerely endeavor to spread his message as it is. Prabhupada talked about the authoritative source, the bona fide spiritual master, is like a postman. He delivers Krishna's message without changing it. He doesn't take anything from it, and he doesn't add anything to it. He delivers it as is, unopened. An unopened letter. So as long as we do this, we can all be representatives in Krishna's line. Because this Guru Tattva is not a single person. Guru Tattva is an energy. It begins with Krishna, and it comes right through the parampara, and we can also be part of that. We don't have to sit around twiddling our thumbs saying we can't find a pure devotee. We can judge by using the Guru Sadhu Shastra that all things should be lined up. But we try our best to help Srila Prabhupada spread Krishna consciousness. And then Krishna will help us from within. Because we're serving in Lord Chaitanya's movement, Lord Chaitanya will be pleased and he will help us from within as well, as long as we remain sincere. Yes? Yes. No, that doesn't say that. I just told you that as long as they are giving Krishna's message unalterated, then they are pure. Now, we don't want to get into criticizing senior devotees. That's not going to help us one little bit. We can hear from authorities, and we can study Srila Prabhupada's books, we can listen to classes, and so many classes are available. There's so much. We have to understand. I've been listening to the strategic planning team, whatever they call themselves, have been putting on a selection about the history of the GBC. And of course the GBC has some not so famous parts of their history. But what you can see through all of this is that Prabhupada has given the perfect way by which ISKCON can keep going and keep spreading Krishna consciousness. Because certain devotees have fallen down, certain devotees had deviated from Srila Prabhupada's teachings. But because the GBC, maybe not immediately, but the GBC did pull it together and did come back to Srila Prabhupada's teachings, that shows the strength, and it shows in comparison to the weaknesses of some other organizations that didn't have such a process. And Prabhupada always talks about the Gaudiyama and how it didn't follow instructions, so therefore it fell to pieces. But ISKCON as a whole is sincerely trying to follow Srila Prabhupada's instructions. We may not always be perfectly in line with Srila Prabhupada, but as long as we keep on endeavoring to do so, then we're all in Lord Chaitanya's worldwide movement. And so that's a very glorious place. And we should never underestimate the value of the association of devotees. We don't need to pick holes with them, that this thing they said is not quite right or something else. As long as we're all sincerely trying to serve Srila Prabhupada. Srila Prabhupada called it unity in diversity. He says that he asked that all the devotees come together once a year, he was suggesting in Mayapur, and they can learn how to be unity and diversity. Because everyone has a slightly different angle, and that's actually wonderful, because my mood will not suit everybody. Not everybody wants to listen to me because I speak in a certain way, I have a certain way of talking, and not everybody wants to listen to me. So I have to appreciate others that preach in a different way, and they preach to a different lot of people. And in that way we can preach to more people, and we can be much more successful. So we have to learn to appreciate differences and not find faults in differences. But yeah, it's very wonderful how Srila Prabhupada has, somebody once explained, I can't remember who it was, but somebody once expressed, how could it be that what Srila Prabhupada put in place was wrong? So what he put in place was right, but it happened through a series of events that showed us how the process worked. That the GBC had to actually become strong and make the process work. And we're still here. ISKCON is still growing and producing, spreading further and further. So it's proof that it's working. Prabhupada would also say that the proof is there is in the results. The Krishna consciousness movement is still spreading. It's proof that the process is working, even though individually we may be faulty. Anything else? Hare Krishna.
So, actually, even Srila Prabhupada said that my only credit is that I have not deviated even 1 inch from my spiritual master's instructions. At the same time, we see Prabhupada wrote Bhagavad-Gita, Srila Bhagavad. He wrote everything in his own words.
Yes.
So, not deviating from the spiritual master's instruction means does not necessarily mean that repeating just exactly what he said. Means you understand it, realize it, and then you explain it in a way which is understandable for the general mass. Just like our speakers also, they add on new realizations. So it is very much valid, I think.
Yes, Srila Prabhupada said that the Acharya's role is to give the teachings of Krishna according to time, place and circumstance. And in several places, especially if you read the Chaitanya Charitamrita, he's explaining that I have to do things differently in America from what might be possible in India. So what's possible in India is not possible in America. It's a different situation, it's a different circumstances. So he's doing things differently. And so the skill, of course, is in recognizing which are principles and which are details. Because principles can never be changed. But details can be adapted according to the circumstances. It's very valid. No problem at all. Yeah. And yes, we add our own realizations that make it meaningful in terms of who we're speaking to. Okay. Anything else? Thank you all very much. Jai Guru Srila Prabhupada Ki Jai.